Welcome to Occult Archives, where we explore the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books.
From mystical grimoires to ancient religious texts.
These books carry secrets too dangerous to be read.
I'm Isabella.
And I'm Chris, and this is Season 1, Episode 26.
Forbidden Scriptures, the hidden power of the Ethiopian Bible.
Let's dive in.
So, you've mentioned an interest in understanding why certain texts become, shrouded in controversy.
Right.
And the Ethiopian Bible is definitely one of those texts.
For sure.
We're going to unpack its unique characteristics and explore the history of why it's been suppressed, and hopefully give you a clear understanding of this really interesting and complex book.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we really want to examine, what makes the Ethiopian Bible so different from other Christian Bibles.
Right.
And then we'll delve into why it's been banned or attempts to ban it have happened throughout history. We're going to try to pull out those key insights so you walk away with a good understanding of this fascinating text.
And to help us do that, we're going to be referencing a number of historical accounts and expert analyses that shed light on the Ethiopian Bible and the forces that have worked against it.
So let's start by looking at the historical roots of Ethiopia and its connection to Christianity.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget just how ancient and significant Ethiopia is as a region.
Mm-hmm.
Nelson Mandela actually once said that Ethiopia always has a special place in my imagination and that it felt like his own genesis.
Wow.
Which speaks to, its long history and cultural significance.
Absolutely. And, Ethiopia was home to some really early civilizations.
Right.
We should mention the Kingdom of DMT, which goes back maybe to the 8th century BC. And then, of course, the Kingdom of Axum, which rose to power around the 1st century AD.
And Axum was really a powerhouse in its time.
Yeah. Definitely a major player.
It controlled a vast area of the Horn of Africa.
A huge chunk of the Horn of Africa, and a vital trading hub connecting Rome and India.
Right.
They were known for impressive architecture, too, like the incredible obelisks that are still standing today.
Yeah.
But most important for our conversation today, they adopted Christianity as the state religion in the 4th century AD.
That's incredibly early.
Very, very early.
So what happened after Axum's prominence?
Well, they faced some challenges. The rise of Islamic powers in the 7th century led to a gradual shift away from Axum's direct control.
Okay.
But the Christian tradition persisted, and Axum was eventually succeeded by the Zagwe dynasty, which ruled from around the 12th to the 13th centuries.
Okay.
They are particularly known for the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela.
Oh, yeah, I've seen pictures of those.
Oh, they're absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Carved directly out of the earth. These incredible architectural feats.
It's hard to even imagine how they created those.
I know the skill and dedication is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, for sure.
And then in the 13th century, we see the emergence of the Solomonic dynasty.
Yeah.
And this is particularly relevant to our discussion of the Ethiopian Bible because they claimed a direct lineage tracing back to the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba.
Oh, wow. So that's where the connection comes in.
That's where it starts, yeah.
Okay, so that kind of lays the groundwork for why the Ethiopian Bible might have some unique characteristics.
Right.
So let's dive into those a little bit.
Okay.
One thing that really stood out to me is that Ethiopia is the only African country with an alphabet over 2,000 years old.
It's true.
It's a pretty significant marker of cultural history.
Absolutely. Their script, Ge'ez, is ancient.
Wow.
Predates many European languages.
And when we look at the Ethiopian Bible itself, it stands apart in some really interesting ways.
Oh, for sure.
For instance, it doesn't have the traditional 66 books like the King James Version that many people are familiar with.
Right.
It has 88.
88, that's a lot more.
Yeah, that's a significant difference.
But
where do those additional books come from?
Well, they include a number of writings that either not accepted into the canon by other Christian traditions, or simply not found in other Bibles.
Oh, interesting.
And what's really intriguing is that there's evidence suggesting that Ethiopians had access to some Old Testament scrolls even before the formal adoption of Christianity in the 4th century.
So they had these texts before they even adopted Christianity.
It seems so, which hints at a very early connection to these traditions.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it?
So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which we've talked about a bit, is one of the oldest organized Christian bodies in the world.
Hmm,
And their Bible, with its expanded content, reflects that longer and more independent historical development.
exactly.
And as you mentioned, the Ethiopian Bible is written in Ge'ez, this ancient Semitic language.
Right.
The history of its translation is also pretty interesting.
Yeah.
While Christianity became the state religion in the 4th century, the Bible wasn't fully translated into Ge'ez until later.
That's
Early church fathers began the work, but it's believed that the complete translation from Greek into Ge'ez wasn't finished until the 8th century by a monk named Abba Pantaleon.
wow.
Our source mentions two main collections within the Ethiopian Bible, the Kebra Nagast and the Fetha Nagast. Can you tell us a little bit about what each of those focuses on?
Sure. The Kebra which translates roughly to the glory of kings, primarily focuses on the Old Testament narratives,
Hmm.
but with significant expansions, particularly elaborating on the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and their lineage.
Okay.
The Fethanagas, or the Law of the Kings, deals more with legal and ecclesiastical matters, drawing from both biblical principles and Byzantine legal traditions.
Interesting.
It essentially served as a guide for both religious and secular law in Ethiopia.
And it wasn't a static text, right? There was a revision that took place in the 17th century.
You're right. In 1630, under Emperor Johannes, a scholar named Abba Bar-Re undertook a major revision of the Bible. This was a significant effort to update the language and ensure the accuracy of the translation after centuries of use and transmission.
Okay, so now let's get to one of the most fascinating and, as our source points out, contentious aspects of the Ethiopian Bible, the much more detailed accounts of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, particularly within the Kebra Nagast.
Yes, this is where things get really interesting.
Right.
The Ethiopian narrative expands upon the brief account we find in what's often called the Western Bible, specifically in 1 Kings chapter 10.
Right.
That account tells us about the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon, drawn by his wisdom and the gifts she brought.
Yeah, she was portrayed as a seeker of knowledge, wanting to test Solomon's understanding.
Exactly. But the Kebra Nagast goes much further, revealing that during her time in Jerusalem, the Queen and King Solomon had a son together named Menelik.
Wow.
And unlike the standard Western narrative, the Kebra Nagast states that Queen Sheba took Menelik back to Ethiopia, and he eventually became the first emperor of Ethiopia, establishing that direct lineage from Solomon.
That's a huge difference in the story.
A fundamental difference with big implications for Ethiopian identity.
Absolutely. And the source even mentions some genetic research from 2012 that some interpret as offering support for this connection.
Yes, there's been expert analysis of the genetic makeup of certain Ethiopian populations that suggests potential evidence lending some plausibility to the Queen's journey and the establishment of that Solomonic lineage. It's a fascinating area of ongoing research.
So it seems like these stories within the Ethiopian Bible, especially the connection to Solomon and Sheba, became a key reason why some sought to suppress it.
Yes, it challenged their own interpretations of biblical history and authority.
So let's unpack those reasons for the banning and suppression of the Ethiopian Bible.
Okay.
The first one our sources point to is doctrinal differences.
Right.
How did the unique content of the Ethiopian Bible clash with mainstream European Christian beliefs?
Well, it's largely due to the inclusion of those deuterocanonical or apocryphal books.
Right.
As European missionaries and scholars engaged with the Ethiopian Bible during the colonial era, they found these additional texts like Enoch, Jubilees, Tobit, and others that weren't part of the Protestant and, to some extent, even the Catholic biblical canons.
And these weren't just, minor variations. These books contain significantly different stories and theological perspectives.
Exactly. For the most part, European denominations consider these books non-canonical, questioning their authenticity and their place within Christian theology.
They essentially didn't see them as part of the Bible.
Right? Some argued that these texts were inconsistent with mainstream Christian doctrine and shouldn't be considered authoritative scripture.
Okay, so that makes sense from a theological standpoint, but it sounds like doctrinal differences were only part of the story.
Yeah, only one piece of the puzzle.
The source also emphasizes the role of European colonial power and the desire for control as a major factor.
Absolutely.
How did that play out in the suppression of the Ethiopian Bible?
Well, take Italy's occupation of Ethiopia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The colonial powers saw the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and its distinct Bible. as obstacles to their goal of exerting political and cultural control and promoting their own version of Christianity.
So it wasn't just about theological disagreements, it was about power and dominance,
Precisely.
undermining a key element of Ethiopian identity.
Exactly.
So-
There's this dismissal of the Ethiopian Bible as being somehow less valid or inferior to the versions used by Western denominations.
Wow.
But, the history of the Bible's origins and transmission is complex and deeply rooted in the Middle East and Africa.
Right.
For European powers to assert sole authority over what is a valid biblical text, that's a perspective heavily influenced by their colonial agendas.
And they actively worked to discredit the Ethiopian Bible.
They did. They criticized its content, the Ge'ez language, and its unique interpretations. This led to its marginalization within mainstream biblical scholarship.
And it sounds like this desire for control extended beyond religious doctrine. They wanted to undermine Ethiopian culture and traditions more broadly.
That's a crucial point. European colonizers, including earlier Portuguese efforts, aimed to suppress indigenous cultures and traditions to solidify their control.
So banning the Ethiopian Bible, which was central to Ethiopian identity, was a key tactic.
It was a major part of their strategy. They saw it as a symbol of Ethiopian resistance and a hindrance to their attempts to impose European cultural and religious norms.
They really wanted to dismantle those traditions at their core.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the role of missionary activities in this suppression.
Right.
How did European missionaries view the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and its Bible?
Well, they often saw them not as fellow Christians, but as rivals in their mission to convert the Ethiopian population.
So there was competition between different Christian denominations.
Yeah, vying for influence and promoting their own versions of the Bible.
Interesting. And this competition was tied to the broader political landscape.
Definitely, European powers wanted to control Ethiopia and its religious institutions for their own gain.
And how did they go about doing that?
One tactic was to support rival factions within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church itself, hoping to create division and weaken its authority.
A classic divide and conquer strategy?
Exactly. They would support bishops or clergy who were more open to European influence and undermine those who resisted.
They wanted to control the church from within.
Yes, and they also desired to gain control of government positions to exert pressure on the Ethiopian monarch regarding the church's practices.
Weakening the church's autonomy and influence. And our source mentions that the Catholic Church formally banned the Ethiopian Bible in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
That seems like a significant moment in this history.
It was. It marked a culmination of these various pressures. This banning was largely driven by European missionaries and scholars who questioned its authenticity and theological soundness.
So let's go back to those banned books for a moment. You mentioned Enoch, Jubilees, Tobit, and several others. Can you give us a little more insight into why these texts were so controversial?
Sure. It's really about the unique content they offer. For example, the Book of Enoch delves into the origins of evil. The story of fallen angels offers a different perspective on the Genesis flood, and even touches on prophecies related to a future messianic reign.
Topics not really addressed in the canonical books of Western Bibles?
Exactly. And then you have Jubilees, which offers a retelling of biblical history with a strong emphasis on the Sabbath and other religious practices according to a very specific calendar.
So a different interpretation of biblical events and timelines.
Right. And then there are books like Judith and Maccabees, which offer important historical and heroic narratives from the Second Temple period that are not found in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
Judith tells the story of a Jewish widow who saves her people from an invading army, while the books of Maccabees recount the Maccabean revolt and the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem, which is the basis for the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah.
So these weren't just minor additions. They contained very different stories, interpretations of history, and theological emphasis that challenged the established framework of European Christianity.
Precisely. While these books are sacred within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, their absence from the Hebrew Bible and other Christian canons led to their classification as apocryphal.
Meaning hidden or non-canonical.
Exactly. And this designation contributed to the desire to suppress the Ethiopian Bible.
Wow, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into a truly unique and often overlooked religious text.
I agree.
So let's summarize some key takeaways for our listeners.
Okay, so we've seen how the Ethiopian Bible holds a unique position deeply intertwined with Ethiopia's ancient history and national identity, particularly through the Solomonic dynasty and their claim of lineage from King Solomon.
Right.
We've also examined the complex interplay of religious disagreements, colonial ambitions, and political power dynamics that led to the suppression of this ancient text.
And hopefully this deep dive has provided you with a clearer and more nuanced understanding of why the Ethiopian Bible has been both revered and suppressed.
This story really makes you wonder, considering what happened to the Ethiopian Bible, what other historical texts might hold similarly complex tales of cultural clash and struggles over knowledge and influence.
That's a great question to ponder. What are we missing or misinterpreting due to these historical interventions in the preservation and transmission of knowledge?
It makes you think.
It really does. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden power of the Ethiopian Bible.
Thank you for listening.
Until our next deep dive, keep questioning and keep learning.